Okay, as I indicated last time, I do have a little bit of, quote, lecture material, but I thought that, we could make use of this class to have considerably more discussion about Reagan and anything else I guess you want to talk about. So you can feel free to interrupt me while I'm doing, a little bit of a presentation, but be assured that, and I don't even have any charts today, so I'm sorry, as a disappointment. You can still go on the website and you want to look at old charts, they're still there. But I will make a few remarks about Reagan's legacy and then a little bit of comparison to the conservatism that Reagan represented, that now how that compares or contrasts to what we're seeing today. Some of the same things I talked about at the opening, but now with a little bit other elaboration. Yeah. It's a hard question. When you ask how important a president was Ronald Reagan and what's his legacy, I'm sure you're aware that there are, various kinds of rankings of presidents that put out. They ask popular opinion polls about how you rank different presidents, and I don't put, typically more recent presidents in public opinion polls are going to be rated more highly because people can remember them. So I don't ever pay much attention to that. But then they do polls, some mysterious do polls of historians, people who should be qualified to make some sort of at least informed judgment about the quality of presidents. And C-SPAN does one periodically, and they've actually done one in 2017, a survey of, I think it's about 50 historians, most of them academics, but also some more popular journalistic writers who've written about the presidency. And so that it would be one way of thinking about how significant a presidency was Reagan's. However, when you come up with the rankings, I've taken the top 12, but they rank them, 1 through the what is it, 40, what are we at, 47 now? I can't even remember. But I've put up the top 12. Those numbers, this survey included kind of 5 or 6 different categories in terms of crisis management, economic management, setting the agenda, things of that sort. And then there was a point total. So those numbers represent the point totals that this survey came up with the ranking, and you can see that Ronald Reagan came in at number 9. I think that's actually, it's so hard to compare presidents before the modern era and presidents today. The whole function of presidents before the 20th century was quite different with regard to legislation or legislative leadership. The parties functioned differently. It's really hard to make comparisons, I think. But when I look at the 20th century, I look at these ratings. Have you had enough time to look at those? Yeah.
Is there an ambiguity in the criteria? In other words, is it significance or excellence? Hitler would be high on a significant leaders.
Yeah, I think you could all hear Dwight's comment. Yes, clearly there's a big difference between like even impact or significance and quality of excellence in terms of admirable impact. And I think the way the questions were worded, I think in this survey refers more to quality than it just does to impact, I think. I saw the categories, but I didn't actually see exactly the way the questions were worded when I looked at this online. But for me, looking at this listing, I'll get to the point here. If I'm looking at modern presidents, at least since, say, 1900, to put John Kennedy in the top 10 of presidents, just as an example, is to me a ridiculous ranking. Because he was only president for 3 years. He got no real significant legislation accomplished. What was his, huge legacy in terms of foreign policy? It just seemed ridiculous to me. I can see an argument for say Harry Truman maybe, because of the significance of the changing role of America in the world after World War II. But in general, to me, especially if I look at legislative impact and basically putting forward a program and getting a program adopted by Congress and put into law, that Reagan, to me, is one of the 4 major presidents of the 20th century. Because he came into office, he proposed a major tax cut, he proposed a dramatic increase in military spending, he proposed and succeeded in having some cuts in social welfare spending early on, but especially those top 2 priorities, he came in with clear priorities, got them adopted right away, and they were significant pieces of legislation. You could then add also that the later tax reform of 1986 was also quite significant, that he was a champion of. So if I'm looking at presidents in the modern era, well, FDR still comes in first by any standard. Yes, Frank?
Okay, the only question I have on that listing would be Wilson, due to the fact that, the League of Nations...
No, but this is you have to read carefully here. Legislative, success and impact of legislative agenda. So I'm going to get to foreign policy in a bit. In fact, that's the next header.
See, I think Wilson was a disaster in foreign policy.
Yeah, well, yes, Bob pointed out the fact that Wilson was a racist as well as having had problems in his foreign policy. But in terms of legislative agenda, this takes us well off of Reagan. But when Wilson came in, he had, in his first 2 years in the presidency, he basically enacted the progressive agenda, the Federal Trade Commission, the complete change in the tariff system, and perhaps most importantly, the Federal Reserve System. So he had a major legislative impact. In fact, if I go back.
You mean Wilson did?
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you said Reagan.
No, Wilson did. And, when you look on this list, Theodore Roosevelt is listed as number 4, but I'd be hard-pressed to say that he had a major legislative impact. What I think one of the reasons that historians rated Theodore Roosevelt so highly, this is all asides from talking about Reagan, but it's all right. That with regard to Theodore Roosevelt, the notion of the modern presidency, the president being the leading figure in the government and being, really being the most prominent political figure in America. If you look at the period after Lincoln to McKinley, who was the president just before Theodore Roosevelt, the whole period, and I asked you, name all the presidents and name them in order. Even historians would be hard-pressed to do that, because the American government was dominated by the Congress in the second half of the 19th century. Presidents were really almost, I won't say they were inconsequential figures, but they were not the kind of significant figures that they would become. Theodore Roosevelt's probably on here because more than anyone before him, since Lincoln at least, he became a dominant cultural and political figure. So maybe that's why historians have rated him so highly. But in terms of legislative impact, not so much. That's why I would put Wilson much ahead of him. Okay, and then when you look at that list, LBJ and the Great Society, huge impact in legislation. But when you're trying to then do overall evaluations, if you also look at foreign policy impact, successes or failures, I mean, Lyndon Johnson, I think, would have gone down as one of the truly great presidents of modern American history, except there's a big except, and that was Vietnam. So, Johnson was still in that top 12, but he wanted to emulate FDR in terms of having the Great Society go down alongside the New Deal as the great legislative accomplishments of the modern era, and it might have done so, but then with Vietnam, that pretty much destroyed the Johnson presidency. And the same thing, I agree with you, Frank, about Wilson, that whatever the merits of his ideas about the League of Nations, the implementation left a lot to be desired in terms of the politics of getting it enacted. And so by the time he left office, his foreign policy legacy was a disaster.
Right, because the Treaty of Versailles and subsequent treaties after that certainly were anything like the League of Nations should have been. I mean, look at Iraq as a classic example of that. The whole Mideast policy was a mess coming out of Versailles. So.
Yeah, there were a lot of you know, the settlement of World War I clearly did not prove to be a lasting one, is obvious. Flawed, yes, that's a good word. Yes.
This is kind of an aside, but
This whole thing has been an aside.
foreign policy. What about Nixon's opening up to China? Is that pretty small stuff in your opinion? Or?
The question was, what about Nixon and opening up to China in terms of foreign policy? That was clearly a very significant effect. And in fact, the first arms control agreements, you know, with Russia as well. So there were important foreign policy matters. If you look at his overall foreign policy, I wouldn't necessarily give him high marks because of a lot of other things. But he doesn't have the, I mean, not only did his, you know, because he was forced out of office, you know, he did resign, but he would have been not only impeached, but then convicted had he not resigned. That really does detract from the quality of a presidency. So, yeah. No, I understand. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but that's why, but I had limited the list to the 4 because they also had legislative accomplishments. And then if you're looking at overall, you know, impact and quality, then Nixon wouldn't have qualified. There was a lot of actually fairly important legislation under Nixon, but the whole Watergate thing was really not good. Okay, so then we're getting down to, if you look at the 20th century, to me in a lot of respects in terms of impact, and again, this is not my view of quality necessarily, but of significance, and that the Reagan presidency clearly was a quite important one. And most important, in some ways most important, you know, a lot of historians and a lot of Americans, you know, looking at Reagan's legacy, what's one of the most important things they'll say is that Reagan brought about the resurgence of conservatism in America, and in a sense, that is best summed up by the notion that that he put forward, that government is not the solution to the problem, it is the problem. And so that idea, when you think of the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt, which was, you know, the federal government is what we turn to deal with the crisis and then to deal with all kinds of problems, and that was attempted to be reinforced by Lyndon Johnson to carry the New Deal to another level, but of government responding and trying to deal with problems. And so for at least more than a generation, I think there was a pretty positive attitude toward the role of, and I'm talking primarily about the federal government, that the federal government is something you turn to. But with Reagan, clearly, and ever since, there's been a lot of suspicion about the federal government, and so that you even had, when Clinton was president, I'm sure you know, most of you remember, you know, he basically acknowledged that the era of big government is over. And so that, in a lot of ways, is the most important legacy of Ronald Reagan, changing the nature of the perception, well, confirming, because the change isn't just because of Ronald Reagan. There are a bunch of things going on that made that appeal possible. So in looking at that, was often referred to as a triumph of conservatism, it very much grew out of what was kind of an ongoing backlash against what had transpired during the 1960s. And by what had transpired, that ranged from the kind of the cultural revolution of the 60s. It was a backlash against the Great Society, and in general, the turmoil that the 60s came to represent, and people, wanting to go down a different path, a different direction. And when you look at that backlash and what the roots of that backlash were, I think there are two reinforcing factors that contributed to the growth of backlash and the turning of the American people, or at least a significant number of Americans, toward a more conservative attitude toward the federal government. And those two kind of streams that I think often reinforced each other, one was economic and one would be social, racial. Not only racial, but I'll talk a little bit also about gender and even more importantly, the kind of the reaction against the 60s generation, the youth generation of the 60s, which looking around, I mean, quite a number of us might have belonged to. Now, when you look at the economic situation, I talked a little bit about this earlier on in the course, and you go back to the 70s and what was happening to the American economy, let me go back before the 70s. From the end of the Great Depression, and actually starting even while World War II was going on, up to the end of the 1960s, the American economy was growing at a good pace with relatively moderate inflation and exercised a really dominant role in the world economy. I think I can't remember whether I mentioned this statistic before, but at the end of World War II, the United States was producing roughly 1/2 of all the world's goods and services. At the end of World War II, the United States was producing roughly 1/2 of all the world's goods and services. I mean, the U.S. was in such a dominant position at the end of the war, and although the American economy, had its ups and downs, we had recessions in the 40s and 50s and into the 1960s, but if you look at the overall trend line of substantial economic growth, the greatest prosperity that the United States, or in some sense any nation, had ever experienced, that was widely enjoyed. I mean, standards of living were going up, wages were going up, and at a time of such economic prosperity, post-World War II to the end of the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson came along and began proposing various programs to deal with what poverty did continue to exist in the United States, it wasn't that hard. It wasn't totally easy, but it wasn't that hard to convince a significant number of Americans that, yeah, we can afford this too. I mean, we're the richest country in the world. We're doing great. Can't we afford to put aside some money in the federal budget to, help deal with some of the social problems which still exist? And obviously, at least up to the mid-60s, a significant number of Americans said, yeah, we're willing to do that. We're willing to support programs that are part of the Great Society. Then a couple of things. Now, Vietnam certainly undercut substantially the willingness of Americans to spend on both guns and butter at the same time. But even beyond just Vietnam itself, beginning in the late 1960s, and then especially in the early 70s on, the United States economy no longer enjoyed the same position of, global domination that it had before. Wages and economic security began to be undermined. And what, in a lot of ways, set the stage for the questioning of turning to the federal government, including spending by the federal government, to deal with social issues like poverty, that when people are beginning to be more concerned about their own, economic security, they're then going to be less willing to support a liberal or progressive program to spend tax dollars on dealing with social issues. So there's an economic foundation to the setting in which Reagan would come forward and say, government is not the solution, it's part of the problem. One other I love, no charts today, but I can't resist tossing out another economic factoid in support of this. From the late 1890s until, I didn't write this down, but I think it's until 1971, for roughly 3/4 of a century, the United States always had a trade surplus. Every single year for roughly 3/4 of a century, the United States had a trade surplus. In the early 1970s, this was when when Nixon was president, the United States experienced for the first time in 3/4 of a century a trade deficit, and began also, this started for some other reasons in the late 60s, began to have a flow of gold out of Fort Knox. And so just the whole global position of the United States economy, it wasn't like we still were not the greatest economic power in the world, it's just a matter of relative dominance was no longer there. So on the one hand, social welfare, as I put it up there, social welfare spending in a time of prosperity is a lot easier than in a time of what came to be known as stagflation, or basically recession combined with inflation, or unemployment and inflation occurring simultaneously in the early 1970s. And then subsequently, we didn't always have stagflation, but we didn't have the kind of booming economy. Even as I said under Reagan, remember when I had all those statistics, after 1982, the economy picked up and it grew, but the 80s really did not compare in terms of the widespread sharing of prosperity or even the nature of the prosperity itself with what had taken place after World War II through the 1960s. But the other factor in terms of the backlash to the I said to the 60s, I'll call it a backlash to liberalism or progressivism, and the greater appeal of what is often just referred to as conservatism. I do think there was a racial dimension to that backlash, because what is the 60s noted for also in a significant way, it was the civil rights movement. And I think speaking to this audience, people are well aware that in the South before the 60s was overwhelmingly Democratic. And if you go back to the New Deal in the 1930s, one of the strongest regions of support for the New Deal was actually the South. I mean, Alabama had actually a very progressive, at least in terms of New Deal issues, which didn't touch directly upon race. Alabama was gung-ho supporters of the New Deal, and the entire South was obviously the solid South, meaning it was solidly Democratic as opposed to solidly Republican. But I think the civil rights movement, can you
explain in a few words why the South was so gung-ho for the New Deal?
Okay, the question is why was the South so supportive of the New Deal? And first of all, as I think you all know, because the legacy of the Civil War and the fact that it was Republicans, who had ended slavery, It was Republicans who had imposed Reconstruction on the South. Once, Reconstruction governments were brought to an end, the white South, black Southerners, so long as they could vote, which is up until roughly the 1890s, were Republicans, but whites, increasingly because of the Civil War legacy, were Democrats. And so that explains, before the Civil War, there was a two-party system in the South. But, so they were Democrat. And then in terms of being strong supporters of the New Deal, much of the New Deal, things like especially like the Tennessee Valley Authority and other rural electrification, there were a lot of New Deal programs which benefited the South in some ways more than any other region. So, I'm sorry?
Farm-to-market roads.
Farm-to-market roads, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration providing, subsidies to farmers, though that actually in the long run sort of contributed to mechanization of farming. But because a lot of the programs of the New Deal had a direct benefit to the South. And the New Deal generally steered away from directly addressing the racial issue. And otherwise there would have been problems, because when Johnson and the Great Society came along, a lot of those Great Society anti-poverty programs that Johnson favored, clearly, since there was more poverty in the South than any place else, those programs would have benefited the South more than any other region. But that didn't offset the fact that, unlike the New Deal, the Great Society did try to address directly the racial question as well. And so the racial question was more significant in the 60s, ultimately, to many white Southerners than the economic benefits that might have come from those federal programs. And I think if you look in general, it wasn't just the South also that reacted, in part, I wouldn't say it's only racial, but in part on the basis of race, because if you look at what it began to happen in northern cities with urban ghettos, where there were also, rioting taking place after 1964, sort of culminating by 1968, that the whole race issue became much more intensified and sort of set the stage for a reaction against the federal government intervening in ways that were perceived by many people as benefiting, minorities as well, particularly African Americans. And when you look at the race question, in the majority of people who, if you look at absolute numbers, I'm sure you all know this, if you look at absolute numbers, the number of people who would benefit from programs that were part of the so-called war on poverty, the majority of people for whom those programs were created were white. But that was not often the public perception. On a percentage basis, since more African Americans were in poverty than whites were in poverty, on a percentage basis, African Americans may have been overrepresented in the number of people getting benefits, but still the majority of people getting benefits were white. But that didn't mean that the perception wasn't developing in many parts of the country, and not just the South, for sure not just the South, that such programs were really directed to help minorities and blacks in particular. And that caused a certain resentment, especially when you link that with the fact that wages were no longer beginning to grow for working people. And so that was a very bad combination in terms of a negative reaction to what had been attempted in terms of so-called progressive or liberal legislation. And also, I think it's no coincidence that when you look at support for social welfare programs, why is it that in the last generation, public support in terms of willingness to spend tax dollars on public education has declined? I mean, there's just no question that public support for education is not what it used to be, for public education is not what it used to be. And I don't think there's much doubt, really, that one of the key factors in that is that we now have a much higher percentage of minority students in our K through 12 systems across the country than we would have, say, in the 1950s, when public support for education was widely perceived as support for, you know, the children of white families so that they could advance. And this is not just K through 12, but through university education. And again, you know, I'm sure a lot of us, if we went to public universities, most of us, I guess, would have been going in, let's say, the 60s, when you didn't even have to pay, you know, I went to the University of California, we didn't really pay tuition, we paid maybe at most a couple $100s a year in incidental fees for one of the best educations in the world. And that was true in so many public universities. That's not true anymore, and it's not true in part because of the decline of public support for education. And then I mentioned one other thing in terms of, again, this is all why Reagan could become the successful, I'd say, in basically changing the nature of the public discussion of the role of government, and especially of the federal government in American politics. And the notion that by the end of his time in office, with the Cold War coming to an end, one of the important, and this takes us past his term in office, but I think it's another factor why people can look back and say Reagan helped to transform American politics from a kind of a liberal context to a much more conservative one, is that when the Cold War came to an end, and then the Soviet Union literally fell apart, it was widely perceived not only that the United States had won the Cold War, but that the United States had won the Cold War because of our commitment to capitalism and free market economics. And the notion that government should intervene or regulate the economy was undermined by the notion that what set us apart from the communist Soviet Union was we believed in free markets. And if we believe in free markets, why should the federal government or even state governments be intervening to try to determine outcomes or, you know, create too many regulations that will prevent the free market from producing the best outcomes? And so I think the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, was also helped to solidify that notion that Reagan's legacy of the triumph of conservatism could basically be more well established. Okay, and then let's see, how are we doing here? We're doing fine. We still have plenty of time for talk. Okay, and then that takes us back to where we started the course the first time when I was talking about, you know, looking then and now, sort of, and the comparisons and contrasts to the Reagan version of conservatism and well, and I put it in, let's call it Trump's version of conservatism. I mean, there is some degree of continuity. We talked about that at the beginning, of certain issues, you know, carry over. But it also would emphasize that the context of conservatism and some of the features of what's taking place in American politics today seem to me to be distinguishable. You know, I would remind you, and I talked about this earlier, in terms of the partisan identification of conservatism. When Reagan was president, there were conservatives, and I'm telling you what you already know, actually. A lot of this course, I'm telling you what you already know. But in terms of putting it in a nice outline form, if you look at the 1980s, there were definitely conservatives within the Democratic Party. I mean, there there were still some Southern Democrats in those days who were white and conservative, as well as conservatives outside. And if you look at the Republican Party in the 1980s, there were definitely liberals within the Republican Party. There had been support for civil rights legislation going back to the 60s by some Republicans. And certainly within the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan, it was not monolithically conservative. And the degree of partisanship today and the identification of conservatism so uniquely with the Republican Party and of liberalism or progressivism with the Democrats, it's a really different kind of context today than it was 30 years ago. And I think to me there's some good things about that and some bad things about that. The older system tended to force everything toward the center, and that meant that oftentimes, if on either side, either the right or the left, if there had been possibly really good proposals for solutions to social problems, they tended to get blurred and moved more toward the center, so you had a less clear-cut politics. We now have a lot more clear-cut politics, but obviously there's some problems with that as well. And then, again, coming back, this is by way of a review, you think about, I mentioned the race issue, and how I think that there was a racial component to the Republican triumphs of the 1980s, but nevertheless, no one ever called Ronald Reagan a white nationalist or his supporters, the bulk of his supporters. No one would have thought of calling the movement that brought Reagan to power white nationalist. Now, whether Donald Trump is a white nationalist or not, I won't venture an opinion about that. But there's no question that there are significant groups strongly supporting Trump that would proudly proclaim themselves to be white nationalists. And if you look at an easy way of noting the contrast between the version of conservatism that Trump now does seem to represent and the version of conservatism that Ronald Reagan represented in the 1980s, just remember again the approaches to immigration. I mean, Ronald Reagan, just as a quick reminder, was really a pretty strong supporter of comprehensive immigration reform that included a path to citizenship for undocumented aliens residing in the United States, something that is just anathema to Donald Trump and most of his supporters. So there's a much harder edge on this dimension today than there was 30 years ago. And then, in terms of social issues, there definitely was a cultural backlash to the so-called in the 80s. There was still that legacy of a backlash to hippies and free sex and concerns about, moral concerns about what had been happening in America. Although by the 70s, people didn't talk really much about hippies too much anymore after the 60s. But there still was that holdover of people who had been concerned about what many saw as the excesses of the young generation of the 60s. But I would say that there has been an intensification, and there were certain, before I get to my but, and, I'm still at an and in addition to those concerns about sort of the hippies of the 60s and what they may or may not have represented, there were other social issues that were, significant to many supporters of Ronald Reagan. Social religious issues like prayer in schools was a substantial issue. Abortion was certainly an important issue in the 1980s for many conservatives who were supportive of Ronald Reagan. But I'd say, the if anything, there's been an intensification over certain other kinds of social issues more recently. I mean, gay rights wasn't much of an issue. Same-sex marriage, no one was talking about that in the 1980s. So there have been other social issues which have been pretty intense that people weren't even thinking much about, or not, maybe some were thinking, but not talking too much publicly about in the 1980s. And so, you know, in some ways, when I look at gender, because the whole same-sex question, homosexuality, these are all questions about concerns about gender issues. And there were gender issue concerns in the 80s. I'm sure, how many of you remember Phyllis Schlafly? I mean, and the Equal Rights Amendment, which was a major issue in the 70s and into the 80s. Remember the Equal Rights Amendment it came within 3 states of being adopted as an amendment to the Constitution. So it was a hot issue in the 70s. So maybe the contrast here isn't as great as I would say the contrast in terms of white nationalism, which is a lot sharper. But here's a really big difference between the conservatism and the America First rhetoric of Donald Trump and many of his supporters and Ronald Reagan. I mean, you couldn't get a clearer contrast in terms of Reagan's view of the United States as the leader of the free world, you know, city upon a hill that, you know, would try to influence the rest of the world directly, as opposed to Donald Trump saying America First basically means, you know, well, it's hard to tell what it means for Donald Trump because actions in some parts of the world, you know, like in Afghanistan, or there are some other examples where he seems to be more involved. But the general perspective that he offers is one of the United States, you know, not assuming a position of leadership in the world in the way that Ronald Reagan would have thought it was just a foregone conclusion. So those are some thoughts. I don't have a final conclusion because we have time. Do you want to take a break and then come back and just have discussion? How about that as a... I think is everybody back? Sure. Well, my plan is now to just open it for discussion, which means not only questions, but if you have comments you want to make that I'm sure, yes, Phil?
I wonder if you, for those of us that don't really remember, I wonder if you could comment a little bit about Reagan's Supreme Court appointees and some of the legacy there.
Okay, well, you know, the one that stands out most, I'm sorry, the question was about Reagan's Supreme Court nominees. And, you know, the one nomination that pops to mind is the Robert Bork nomination of 1987, because it was the first time in I don't know how long, but a really long time, that a nomination for a new appointment to the court was turned down. Lyndon Johnson had an appointment that did not, he wanted to appoint Abe Fortas as Chief Justice. Abe Fortas was, it wasn't going to be a new appointment, but that didn't happen. But he elevated, I'm trying to remember, didn't he elevate Rehnquist to Chief Justice, I think? And Reagan? Yes, Reagan we're talking about. And the other, Scalia?
Yes.
Yeah. And
Didn't he appoint Souter?
No, that was good.
Is that earlier?
later, I think that was Bush. I think the older Bush. So, but you know, The other one that I should have thought of even before thinking of Bork is that he appointed Sandra Day O'Connor. So that was the first woman to be appointed to the court. And of course, Sandra Day O'Connor, who was from Arizona and was, I think initially thought of as a fairly conservative appointment coming, from the state of Goldwater. She turned out to be, she was a vote pretty much like Kennedy. She was right in the center. So his legacy was not really to transform the court in a way that, some other presidents have been successful in transforming it.
Can you tell us, I can't remember, what was the problem with Bork?
With Bork, what was the problem with Bork? Well, there were a number of things about what he had written, but I think what was also quite important in Bork's failure to be confirmed was that in the Watergate crisis, when Nixon wanted to fire Archibald Cox, and he went to the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, and said, I want you to fire Archibald Cox. This doesn't have any relevance for anything that might happen today, of course. And Cox said, I will not, fire, Cox, who was the special, the independent counsel in the Watergate investigation. And then, so that made Ruckelshaus, who had been an EPA administrator also, made Ruckelshaus, who was the assistant attorney general, the next guy up, and Ruckelshaus said, I will not fire Cox. And then Bork was the solicitor general at the time, so he was third in line, and Bork agreed to fire Cox. So there were also things that he had written about his interpretation of the 14th Amendment and other things that were also problematic, especially for Democrats. But I really think that that legacy of having been willing to fire Cox made a big difference.
An influential vote against Bork was Howell Heflin's, and he charged Bork as being, quote, an extremist, and that was the basis for his no vote, and that was very influential. Heflin's
Yeah.
vote.
Yes.
He's got an excellent record on not having his opinions overturned by higher courts. He has a beautiful judicial record.
Could you all hear that comment? Could you hear both comments back in the corner? That Heflin, Howell Heflin, who was the Alabama senator who considered him an extremist, was an important no vote, but on the other hand, it was pointed out that Bork's lower court rulings had not been overturned by higher courts. I can't believe that there are not other comments or questions. Yes, please.
I was a federal worker when Reagan was in power, and he was kind of stingy with our pay raise. One good thing he did is he turned the hot water back on that Jimmy Carter turned off in the restroom. But Reagan, even though, he wasn't really kind to federal workers, his optimism and stuff still made you feel good about America. And you kind of admired a lot of parts of him, even if you didn't always agree with his policy, where Trump seems more polarizing, where you got his fans, and my friends are his big fans, they think he's fantastic, and there's a lot of others that, just don't like him at all. Where I think Reagan, even people that, there's some people that just really abhorred his policy and didn't like, but I think he was a lot less polarizing. He was a more optimistic person. It was easier for people to like.
He was a cheerleader in college, and he continued as a national cheerleader.
Yeah. Could you hear in the back the comment? Actually, one other thing, I don't think I mentioned this. This is something that you'll remember as soon as I mention it. But very soon after he took office, there was the assassination attempt. And, people did not know this at the time, but he came close to dying. And one of the reasons that people didn't realize that at the time, of course, the doctors were not going to be, blabbing that all over the place, but also because of the way he handled it, his reaction. He was widely quoted at the time, before going into the operating room, making a comment, I hope you're a Republican surgeon, or something to that effect. And I think you're absolutely right that, even people who were critical of his policies could see that Reagan, and this is often said, and even comparing him to Goldwater, that he had a much more kind of optimistic vision of America and presented a more optimistic approach. And if you think about the contrast to Trump, it's not just likability or not likability. It's also a matter of, Trump basically is much more inclined to say, we're, well, when he talked, what was the line he used in his inaugural? That there was a particular word he used which people paid a lot of attention to, but painting a very dark picture of America, whereas Reagan certainly didn't do that.
I mean, do you think that Reagan would have come across as like Trump tries to come across, in my opinion, kind of like he's going to be like some sort of savior, okay? And I never got that impression at all out of Reagan. It wasn't like, oh, I'm the only guy that can solve these problems. Where I think he had was willing to be bipartisan. He was, even though he was a very conservative guy, and quite honestly, I only voted for him once, just, but the fact of the matter is, he never struck me as coming across like that he had all the answers and he was the only guy that could fix things, and he never had that, how would I put this, arrogance that I see in today's political climate.
Yes, Martin?
What about, maybe you could cover this at the beginning, it's kind of peripheral again, but his relationship to the press, and who were his press secretaries? I mean, you think about him as personally as being such an actor, so good at public relations. I can't remember now whether we were raging at his press conferences and press secretaries.
The question was about, Reagan's relationship with the press, and even who was his press secretary, and whether there was the same kind of hostile relationship that obviously exists today with the press and Trump's spokespersons. And I'm just blanking on who his press secretary was.
Brady for a while.
Oh yeah, well, but not for long, because Jim Brady, but not after the assassination attempt, and he was. Gee, I'm forgetting, but there wasn't. Did somebody in the room remember who his press secretary was?
Oh, was it that young woman?
No, I don't think it was a woman.
The one that went on to news?
No, I don't think so. But in terms of the general relationship with the press, it wasn't the antagonistic relationship that exists, clearly with the Trump administration. There was, did I see? Okay, no.
Are historians in agreement about the period when Reagan really started to lose it mentally? Is that clear to us now or not?
The question was about, are historians in agreement about when Reagan's mental condition may have deteriorated? And I don't know, the things I read didn't make that so clear. As I think I said at one time earlier, there was general agreement that even when he became president at the time, not so much about a deterioration of, clearly what later was the Alzheimer's, but that he had been in the habit of napping in the afternoon for a long time. He did not have unlimited energy, and there were better times of the day for him, as I think we commented when we were talking about the Reykjavik summit, and that he wasn't very good on details, and that he often, the way he related to an issue was through anecdotes. That was consistent not with deterioration so much as just the way he was about the way he dealt with politics. But he did rely a lot on staff, and he did that from the very beginning. And the couple things that I referenced in terms of suggested reading, I'd say neither one of them think that mental deterioration really was a significant factor before he left office. Energy, yes, maybe in the sense of not always being on top of his game, and that the people around him were often kind of try to be careful about exposing him to questions or other situations at certain times of the day.
Well, I remember at one point, I think it was a columnist or a reporter or somebody criticized Nancy for occasionally providing him with a word when and this was later on towards the end of the term, like she was feeding him something. She probably was trying to fill in the gap when he couldn't come up with the word.
Yeah, and I'll get to your question just one second. There was an incident too, and actually, he didn't recognize his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Samuel Pierce, who was, I think, the only black in his administration, and he actually didn't recognize him. But I think that actually probably was a comment on how important he thought that position was. Yeah, yeah.
I was in D.C. at the time for both administrations, both terms, and it was kind of a joke among us as young people. Well, our president meets as he gathers around the cabinet table, he meets a new friend every morning. But there is actually, I'm really interested in Nancy Reagan's participation in any decision-making, the idea that there was this Rasputin behind the scenes that was making astrological decisions to Nancy about proper days of travel and whether he should make this decision or that decision. Do you have a comment?
I mean, there clearly was some of that going on. I mean, that's not just made up, but on the other hand, it wasn't like, she was a voice, and I mentioned this briefly in a previous lecture, when Gorbachev came to power, and then the opportunity for pursuing really a much more constructive relationship with the Russians came about. She certainly was on the side of those like George Shultz around Reagan who were supportive of taking advantage of that situation in a positive way, as opposed to people like Caspar Weinberger who were much more dubious about it. So, but I don't know that, and she was his, in some sense, his only friend, his closest and really only confidant on a really personal level, but and she used her authority sometimes within squabbles about personnel within the administration. But I don't think she didn't have a major policy agenda. I think she thought of the opportunity of better relations with the Soviets in the general sense of his place in history would be much higher if he presided over an easing of the Cold War. But she didn't come in, with an agenda that she would have been pushing in the White House.
She got
But
rid of Don Reagan.
yeah,
And John Sears during the campaign.
Yeah, Bob pointed out that she got Donald Reagan, who was the first-term Secretary of the Treasury, and then he swapped jobs with James Baker and became Chief of Staff. And Nancy did not like him, and ultimately was responsible for getting him out. So she definitely played a role in personnel decisions, but I think less so in terms of, she was less concerned about policy than she was about who she thought was doing the best job of sort of serving her husband's interests.
This question doesn't have to do specifically with, or exclusively with these two presidencies, but I'm interested in knowing more about the changing, the nominations to the
so much more political thing, and how did that happen?
The question was about how nominations to the Supreme Court have become so political and how did that come about. And actually a lot of historians do point to the Bork nomination as the beginning of that, in that, I mean, even the Fortas situation, Fortas had some personal ethical issues that it was not just Republicans blocking his nomination, but the Bork situation was primarily a kind of a partisan issue. And so even though there have not been instances, there were not a lot of instances after Bork of nominations being rejected by the Senate. I'm trying to think if were there any. I think the only one that came close was the Clarence Thomas nomination, which was a narrow confirmation in the U.S. Senate. So they didn't become politicized to the point that nominations weren't getting through, but
Ginsburg was a pothead.
well, yes.
The male Ginsburg.
Well, yes. Well,
Bork and Kennedy.
Bob pointed out that there was a Douglas Ginsburg nomination that was withdrawn because it was revealed that he had smoked pot. I don't think that would happen now. I mean, that might not be a disqualifying characteristic. But I think the stakes have seemingly become so much higher, and especially with the closely divided court. I mean, given what happened last year with the Democratic nomination, that the balance of the court is so fine meaning narrow, that the appointments seem to take on a whole lot more importance. Plus the fact that previous presidents, in terms of their nominations, you look at the history of nominations, and it is often very hard to tell when you look at a voting record for a justice whether they were appointed by a Republican or a Democrat. Now I think right now it's a lot more predictable in general, depending on which party is making the nomination, what's likely to be the voting record of that person while that person serves on the court. But you think about Earl Warren. Yeah, Earl Warren, I was thinking of that example. Eisenhower later said that was one of the worst decisions he ever made, appointing Earl Warren as Chief Justice. Of course, a lot of other people would say that was one of the best things that Eisenhower ever did. Yes, Chicago?
I was wondering, FDR appointed Democratic judges, and that was a political appointment.
I'm sorry, who?
Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR.
Yes.
Appointed Democratic judges for the Supreme Court. I was wondering if that was
the question had to do with, well, FDR appointed Democratic, justices of the Supreme Court, didn't he? And is that an example then of what was political appointments? And but actually, some of the justices that Franklin Roosevelt appointed subsequently did not become necessarily reliable liberal votes on the court. So most did, and the court was transformed from what it had been. I'm sure now we're getting, you don't remember this. Now we're getting back far enough. I don't remember this either I wasn't alive at the time. But in the 30s there was a huge debate about the court when the Supreme Court was blocking New Deal programs. The New Deal held unconstitutional what were in some senses the two largest or most significant early New Deal programs, the National Recovery Administration and the Agriculture Adjustment Administration. And the court ruled that they were unconstitutional, and then ruled, handed down a number of rulings that were blocking the New Deal. Roosevelt attacked the court, and the so-called court packing, where he tried to get the Congress to agree to a law which would force judges to, if they didn't retire at age 70, then the president could appoint additional judges anyway to try to change the balance. And that didn't happen. We stayed at 9, but one of the conservatives retired, he changed the balance, and then the court started approving all the New Deal programs. That was not the first time that something like that had happened in the aftermath of the Civil War. They changed the number. The Supreme Court has not always been 9 justices. I forget what the exact year that the Congress expanded in the immediate post-Civil War period, but again, the Republicans at that time were running into problems about court obstruction, and they increased the number of justices, and that dealt with the problem. So it's not, political issues are not brand new, but as I said, predicting how a judge is going to perform has not always been very easy. Yeah.
May I ask another question about the trade war during the Reagan administration, trade war between Japan and United States?
The question was about the trade wars between the United States and Japan in the 1980s, given the fact that
It's just like Japan was in the seat of China then.
yes.
And there was this Plaza Accord, which was this financial minister and central bank people and directors meeting of, I think it was 5 countries or 5 or 6 countries. Are you familiar with Plaza Accord to devalue the value of the dollar so that this trade deficit will decrease against Japan and Germany?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of that, but that's, Shigeko's pointed out that, you know, she said correctly that, you know, in the 1980s, remember, everyone was talking about Japan being the rising economic power, and the Japanese model of the way their industries were organized, and that the United States ought to be emulating the corporate structures of Japanese industry, and that the United States had a big trade deficit with Japan when all those cars and electronics were coming into the United States. And I did not remember that Shigeko pointed out that to deal with that, there was a 5-nation agreement that more or less resulted in the dollar being lowered in value in relationship to those other currencies as a way of dealing with the trade deficit. Because if the dollar's worth less, then it makes, you know, imports more expensive, makes our exports less expensive for the other countries as a way of dealing with the deficit.
That time, many Japanese manufacturers moved to their plants to the U.S., like Tennessee, Kentucky, and some near here. And they liked the southern states because of this labor.
Yes, because they're non-union.
So I think that was, in a way, this Reagan's pressure. And it was not Reagan himself, but perhaps the trade representative.
Yes, because I doubt that Reagan thought too much about that kind of issue. But Shigeko pointed out that it was in that time in the 80s that Japan began building its, you know, especially auto plants, you know, here in the United States, is partly to get around that issue. But there would be a difference in that, you know, Trump, you know, the Reagan administration never would have questioned the value of free trade, more or less, whereas obviously the Trump administration has a different approach to trade issues. Devaluation is one way of doing it. What in more, you know, recent years before Trump, the U.S. and China, dealing with China, previous administrations, both Republican and Democrat, have tried to get China to raise the value of its currency as a way of trying to undermine or lessen the trade balance. Yes, Bill?
So now, most every day, we're hearing something about some aspect of the tax reforms, the oldest working his way, bits and starts and so forth. But compare that, and the thrust of that
Okay, the question was about comparing the present proposals about tax reform and tax cuts to the Reagan era tax policies. And so summing up in a way, I dealt with that before, that there is a similarity in that taxes were cut substantially under Reagan. And so in terms of the notion of lowering taxes, that would be common to both approaches. There was also another similarity is that the current Republican proposals, both in the House and the Senate, propose to reduce the number of brackets. The 1986 tax reform legislation also reduced the number of brackets. So simplification in that sense. Big differences. The big difference in terms of the tax reform of 1986 and the so-called tax reform that's proposed now is that, first of all, 86 was bipartisan, as I pointed out before. And today, it's not bipartisan at all. I mean, the whole approach of trying to use reconciliation as the means of getting a tax bill through the Senate is in order to try to do it, without having to rely on a single Democratic vote. So that's just a procedural difference. A substantive difference is that in 1980, this isn't true for the initial tax cut of 1981, when those tax cuts probably did end, not probably, they did end up contributing to the growth of deficits. But in 1986, and 81 wasn't called tax reform, it was just called tax cuts, basically. The tax reform of 86 was specifically designed to be what's called revenue neutral, meaning that the tax code would be rearranged, but in a way that would not result in a reduction of the number of tax dollars coming to the federal government. And the 86 law was, in effect, tax neutral. Whereas, that the best case scenario for the current Republican proposal in the Senate is that it will add, this is the best case scenario, that it would add $1.5 trillion to the deficit over the next 10 years. So that in itself is a big difference. Another big difference is the corporate tax cut that's part of the Republican proposals now is different, well, there wasn't a corporate tax cut in the 1986 law. So and again, I'd say in terms of benefit, the 1981 tax cut did somewhat more benefit, more well-off taxpayers. The 86 law was more neutral in terms of the spread of its effects. And if you look at most, I'd say, nonpartisan analyses of the current proposals in Congress, that the majority of the benefits would go to the more well-off. Plus, the current proposal in the House to completely eliminate the estate tax, that was definitely not part of the Reagan proposals. Nothing else? Okay, well, we'll see what happens.